further ado, Chitra, thank you so much for being here. And the very first question that I would want to ask is about independence itself. The whole premise of the book, the partition which happened in Bengal also, it's not something that we have seen much in Indian writing in English. There's been a lot written about Punjab, about partition, of course. And how did what made you write this? What was the idea behind the book? Tell us, it's about its inception.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me, and it's a great pleasure to see all of you here online. I think Silver Talkies is such a wonderful idea, which is why I agreed to join because, as you might know, I get a lot of invitations, and just because of time and because I have to write, and also because I teach, I can't take on many of them. But when I was approached for this one, I was really interested because I think as we are growing older, how to grow old, uh, actively and gracefully and completely engaged in the world to whatever extent we want is so important. And to have a vehicle which helps us with that and also provides maybe a connection to each other, I think is very, very important. I'm involved with similar aging organizations in this country as well. And so, I think it's wonderful what all of you are doing together. So,
Thank you
yes,
from me.
Independence. How did I start Independence? It is a book I've been thinking of writing for a long time. In fact, after I wrote my previous book, The Last Queen, that led me to write Independence. As you might know, The Last Queen is about the life of Maharani Jinda Kaur, who was a powerful queen of Punjab. She was the last queen of Punjab in the 1800s. In the mid 1800s, Punjab was wrested away from her through um, by the British through a lot of in-house treachery, among other things. But she fought valiantly. She fought the British until the day she died. She was a wonderful um, and strong character who has largely been absent, or I should say, removed from Indian history and Indian history books, as sometimes happens with women. Her importance is um, unknown to many, including myself, until by chance I got to know of her. But when I finished writing her amazing story, that was, as I said, in the 1850s, 1860s, and that was the time when the British had a stranglehold on India. It was for our nation a very sad time. I didn't want to end my exploration into India, historic India at that point. So I wanted to follow that arc to its end when India finally becomes free, becomes decolonized, and the British are kicked out of India. So for that reason, I wanted to write Independence. I also wanted to write it because, just as you said, Reshmi, we don't know that much about what was going on in Bengal, especially on the border. We know about the Punjab border much more, but in English or in any language other than Bengali, really not much has been written. And my own mother and maternal grandfather were involved in the freedom struggle. They were followers of Gandhi. I remember as I was growing up, many stories that they told me, which, like many young people, I did not appreciate at that time. I was like, yeah, yeah, these old stories. But as I grew up and matured, I realized what an amazing movement that was, what amazing stories, how much satisfaction people got out of, I don't know, out of selflessly giving of themselves. I thought that was just very amazing. And also the important part that women played. So all of those reasons came together. All of those old stories kind of, you know, flowered in my heart, I could say, and led me to write this book, which is set in a very similar place to where my grandfather and mother lived. Um, Much of it is set in a village outside of Kolkata, where very similar to my grandfather's village. My grandfather was a doctor who had a village clinic, a free clinic in his village. So I think you can see some connections there. In any case, I thought this was an important story, not just for myself, but for really many, many of us all over the world, but particularly in India today, because, the people who lived through that time and fought that battle for us, most of them have passed away, and most of us were born into a free India, and perhaps we take that freedom for granted. So I just wanted to remind everyone that freedom did not come easy. It is a great privilege. And it is also for us to remember that that freedom happened because everybody pretty much in India came together, regardless of caste and religion and language. And uh, that was such a wonderful moment uh, that allowed us to succeed. So these are some lessons for us, I think, all of us as human beings, certainly all of us as Indians, and particularly for all of us living in a very divided world today. The lesson of the book, in many ways, is one has to come together as a family, as a culture, as a nation, as men and women.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. That's a very different take also and much needed. The question that, as a reader of your book, I'm sure not just me, many of us would want to ask you, are the relationships between the women in your books, they're complex, they're layered, they're fascinating, they're full of love, there is also a bit of jealousy, judgment, there's everything, and you bring it together so beautifully. So, tell us a little bit about what goes on in your mind. How do you bring these nuances, in your different books between women?
Relationships between women, that has been very important for me ever since I began writing. Actually, even before I began writing, when I was in graduate school at the University of California at Berkeley, where I got my PhD, I volunteered for the Women's Center, and I recognized how important it is for women to support each other, to relate to each other, because sometimes there are stories that only other women will understand. There are tragedies and challenges that only other women understand. And, after I graduated, I went on along with a group of women to found the first service supporting women in situations of domestic violence on the west coast of America called Maitri. Maitri has now grown into an amazing, wonderful, large organization supporting women in dangerous situations, in domestic violence situations, etc., just to start a new life. So women and the position of women and the challenges of women have always been important to me. And therefore, I want to write the stories of women because I think books do have, that is my hope as a writer. That's what I've kind of based my life on, that books do have an impact on readers. They have an impact on society. They make us think about things. Maybe they make us rethink things. So women are always at the centers of my books, and here it is the three sisters. They are fictional characters, though, through my research, I know there were women just like that who had to take over the families after the men either went away to fight in the independence struggle or were killed because of that. So women play a very important role at this time, and they had to really step outside of the traditional roles that society had assigned them to, to really help the family survive. So that is very much here. And I wanted three sisters, and I liked the dynamic of three because that's kind of a destabilizing number. That is a number we often see in like fairy tales and folk tales. And I wanted that for the sisters, and I wanted them to be very different. I wanted each of them to have a different goal or a dream in life, which, as they grow through the struggles of independence, some of them will change.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. In fact, because you mentioned Maitri, I also want to mention that Chitra has been an activist in this space. And if you have read her writing, domestic violence, violence against women is something that is there mentioned in her writing. And Chitra has, like you did mention in the previous answer, but it is it deliberately done to create awareness in many ways?
You know, I it's it's an interesting space. It's deliberate, but once I start writing, I have to let go of all agendas and allow the story to kind of unfold on its own. So, yeah, it's in the back of my mind, but then the characters become their own persons, and their adventures and their lives and their dreams uh, take over the story. Otherwise, it would become very wooden. It would not become a real life kind of growing story with complex characters. I did want to bring out that Independence also talks about the other kind of violence that was, that women were subjected to at the at the time of partition. There was a lot of rape and killings of women at this time. So, sometimes we just don't want to talk about these things, but it is important to remember our history and to admit what happened so that we don't repeat such things again. So, yeah, all of those things. And I wanted to, while we are talking about Maitri, talk about a different organization that I'm involved with
Sure.
right now in Houston, titled Daya, and that does exactly the same thing.
Thank you. This is an aspect of yours that many of us didn't know about, and it's great to know this. There's a question that I'll be coming to the questions. In fact, it's a request to all of you. Kindly put your questions in the chat box, and we'll take them up soon. And this is a question that most of us want to ask you, which is about reshaping mythological characters, especially like Draupadi and Sita. What is the kind of research? There are so many things that we would want to ask you about this. What is the kind of research? Why did you want to reshape those characters and tell their stories in the first place? And secondly, what kind of research went into it?
Thank you. That's a great question. Um, first of all, when I was writing Palace of Illusions, I wanted to write it just because I have loved the stories of the epics. I grew up, as I told you, my maternal grandfather was a big influence in my life, a big storyteller, and he loved telling me and my cousins these stories. So they have a very dear place in my heart. But as I was growing up and getting to like high school and college age, it struck me that wait, we don't hear a lot about the women. They are there, but we really don't know what they're thinking, what they're feeling. We just see them as pretty much people that things happen to, and then they have to deal with the aftermath. But how did it feel? And I especially thought about Draupadi when I was thinking this, and later I thought about Sita. Um, that, all of these really, I don't know, life-shattering events that these women go through. What were they thinking? What were they feeling? How did they deal with it? What were their source of strength? And I just decided to write the book from a woman's point of view. I had no idea. At that time, mythology was not a big genre in writing, and everybody told me, nobody's going to be interested in this book. Everyone knows the stories, but I just felt a need. And therefore, I just wrote that book, and I had to do a lot of research because I wanted to make sure that I was getting everything correct, the ambience correct, whatever facts are available correct. It is, of course, the epic times, so it's not exactly historical research, it's really mythological research, but there's a lot of information about daily life, what people ate, what people wore, what were some customs. We know about those things mostly from the Mahabharats. So I did a lot of research on several different versions of Mahabharata, also to get a rounded portrayal of Draupadi. And I realized that there is a great tradition in India of retelling our epics and to retelling our mythological stories. They're retold by many, many people, and everyone takes a slightly different angle. So that gave me a lot of confidence that made me feel like I was following in a tradition. And as you can understand, the woman is at the center. She is telling her own story. And whenever we hear the woman's voice and her take on her experiences, it's going to be different. So that was my whole idea behind writing Palace of Illusions. I had no idea that it would become so popular. I am just so thankful every day that people have loved that book in many
It
ways.
absolutely is. There are so many people who'll tell you that it's one of their favorite books. Uh, you
Thank
know,
you.
the
And what I was really surprised by is how many colleges and universities have taken up that book. Not only have they taught it, but so many graduate students write to me all the time. Oh, I'm doing this for my thesis. I'm doing this for my dissertation. Can I ask you a question? Will you answer it? Appreciative of this whole support of the book in the educational institutions. Not only do I love it because of looking at the woman's take on things, you
absolutely.
know, and being aware of how violence against women feels. Violence against women doesn't just mean killing a woman, but disrobing her in open court, to dishonor her in that way, that's an act of violence. So,
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for such a detailed answer. In fact, when there's something that we were, Nidhi and I were both at Jaipur Lit Fest in 2022. And one of the things, in fact, I was just telling everyone when, you were trying to join, we felt, you're so approachable for a writer of your stature, for someone whose books are probably, in everyone's favorite list. You were approachable, you were very open, and I follow you on Instagram, and you should I wear for this event, and you highlight when some. So over the years, how has your engagement a bit about it?
yeah, you have all these great questions, and there's so much go. Yes, when the internet was just getting started and there wasn't much social media, it was mostly face to face. So I went somewhere and people would come and we would talk about the book and I would sign. That gave me a lot of energy as I went back then into my writer's cubbyhole to work on my next book. And but with to connect with readers, and I do love connecting. I honestly love connecting with readers because it's important for me to know that helps me become a better writer, to know what has succeeded and what maybe has not succeeded. So I'm really always interested in reviews and in on input. I'm interested in, yeah, just the human aspect of this whole reading experience because I love reading. I'm a reader myself. So, yeah, this whole enterprise interests me a lot. And it's just a lot of fun connecting with people and, getting feedback if I have an event coming on. It's nice. And I show different saris. It's nice to know which one appeals to people. It's just a wonderful way of connecting and showing my readers that I do care about having them take precious time out of their lives to read my books. And I really mean that. And I appreciate that. What would writers be without readers?
Absolutely. I'm curious to know, has reader, the kind of books that become popular with readers, has that ever guided your choice of a theme to write?
No, not really. Uh, I have written books that I thought were important. Now, if readers respond positively, yes, it gives me extra energy to write. But for instance, when I was writing The Last Queen, that's really my first historical novel for adults. I wrote one for children titled Freedom Song, which I hope people will look up, especially if you have young people in your lives, because that's also about independence, but an earlier time, many years before independence actually happens. And that's about how children took part in our independence struggle. But for instance, when I got the idea for The Last Queen, um, my agent and my publisher, they were like, not my publisher, but my agent, because she's the one who sees my ideas first. She was like, really, this a queen lived in the 1800s. Do you really think people will be interested? She's not even a very famous figure, not like, Rani of Jhansi or somebody that has name recognition. So she was very doubtful about that enterprise. So, I have to break into new fields. I don't really know what I'm going to write until the idea hits me. And yeah, then I have to trust the story and go along and hope it will connect with readers. So, but I have a lot of trust in, I don't know, the power of characters. So if I'm really taken by a character, I'm really engrossed and enthralled by this person's life and what she is doing, or what, in the case of Independence, what they are doing. I have hope that my readers will also relate to that.
Absolutely. I'm sure all books have their own timeline and research process. But could you tell us? In fact, that's a question yeah, Shobha has asked. Shobha is also from Silver Talkies, from the Silver Talkies team. She's asked, and I'm asking it right now because it connects to my question. How difficult is it to write a book based on a mythological character? And to that, I'm going to add, how's your research process for all these different books? How long does it take you?
Yeah, research takes me a long time. Now, it depends, right? So some books are connected, so the research of one will help me with the research of others. For instance, Forest of Enchantments, which I wrote several years after Palace of Illusions, is based in also a mythological world, the Ramayana, the mythological world of the Ramayana, which goes back actually even older, but in terms of culture is similar in many ways, different in some other ways. So, some of that the cultural research I already knew, the quote unquote historical or mythological world research I already knew, but the story of the Ramayana is very different. I read many, many different Ramayans as I wrote that book. So that was where, and so that I could get the nuance for the character. It was not so much the world, but the nuance for the character. There are such different Ramayans that I had only heard of, but when I started writing, I read them. And for instance, a lot of the angle of Sita being a warrior, Sita being someone who's powerful, is comes from the Adbhut Ramayana, right? Also, people say written by Valmiki, but it shows Sita is very much focused on Sita, and it shows her in a very different light. And I put that into Forest of Enchantments. I thought that was wonderful and very aligned to my belief of Sita, which is that she's a powerful character. She's not just sandwiched between Ram and Lakshman, but she is her own entity. So, like that. Now, historical research, I'll give you something that might be interesting to you. I had all kinds of ideas about historical research when I started writing, or when I started conceiving The Last Queen, which is that I will go to at least a few of the places that were important in The Last Queen. Some I could not go to, like Lahore, but some I could go to, like Amritsar and Kolkata, actually, where there's a great reunion between Maharani Jinda and her son, who had been taken away by the British, and who was, the last king of Punjab. And the British took away his kingdom and took him away and took the Kohinoor away, all of that. So, but just as I was getting ready to do all these things, COVID struck. So I could not do any of it. And I had to say, well, how am I going to write this novel? And then I decided that I would turn to old paintings and old photographs. Now, the book research I'd already done and read a lot of different sources, and I was very fortunate to get hold of a diary written at that time by one of the English women who is a character. So I got a lot of, the British way of looking at Maharani Jinda through that, and there were other sources. But for those visible sources, I turned to paintings and photographs, and really they were very helpful because, for instance, Amritsar as it is today is not at all like Amritsar as it was in Maharani Jinda's day. It would not have given me that feel. But when I looked at the ancient photos, I spent honestly weeks just looking at the map of the Lahore Palace where Maharani Jinda spent many years of her life, where she lived in the Shish Mahal after she became Maharaja Ranjit Singh's wife. So those became very important, and I remembered that so that when I was writing Independence, I went back to the old sources, old newspapers, old photographs, and especially at that time, the photographs around independence were so powerful. Photographs of partition, like literally thousands of people just coming, they're on the top of the train, they're hanging out of the doors, they're just trying to escape to what they feel is safety, their own land. So, I learned that I'm also a very visual person. When I see a photo or a painting, it really goes into me. And so that's just become a part of I think anytime I write a historical book, that's going to become a big part of my research.
Okay, it's fascinating to know about the whole research process. You'd be a meticulous filer, keeping all your research in place and going back to it for another book, you said.
Yes, thank God for the computer because that keeps all my files in order. When I used to write things down, oh, I mean, I have file cabinets, but everything is kind of in disarray. It takes me a long time to find things there. But yes, thank God for computer filing.
Absolutely. So, the I want to ask you about the immigrant experience, which is so central to so many of your books and has been a constant. So, how much of that experience has come from your own? When you went to America as a student, right? First. So, tell us a
Yes.
little bit about it. How much of it came from your own, and how much of it is from what you've seen around you?
It's mostly from what I've seen around me, but the feelings, I felt all those feelings of how it feels to be away from your known world. It's into a whole different, to find oneself in a whole different environment. How does it feel? It is at once exciting and it's a growth experience, but it's also very hard mentally and, hard on the heart to be away from people that were dear to you all your life, and now they're at the other end of the world. And remember, when I first came here, there was no internet. I couldn't just email people. I couldn't, there was no Zoom, uh, there was no WhatsApp to video call people and things of that kind. So it was very expensive to call India for a few minutes. We had to save up money for months to do that. And then it was so stressful because you had 5 minutes, you're trying to say everything. So I remember in those early days just writing it all down so that I could just read it all out to the other person, family at the other end, and they had done the same thing. It was tough, right? Those early days were tough. Um, Tell me what else you were asking in that question.
Basically, how much of it was your own and from
Right, right. How
others?
much of it is my own experience? So some of it, those feelings are my own. A lot of the young women are feeling dislocated. They're also excited about opportunities, but they're feeling dislocated and they're trying to navigate a world, the rules of which they don't quite know. So, sometimes they're making mistakes and so forth, and how to live freely around. There weren't that many immigrants when I first came
Right.
to the United States. And I lived, a small town, relatively small town, now much bigger, in Dayton, Ohio. And there was an Indian community. Then after I went to Berkeley, there was some more, but it was mostly an international community. So some of that is in book. Really, I was looking at everything. I was eavesdropping, listening in on conversations. If I went to like a desi party, what were the women talking about? What were their issues, their problems, their opportunities? So a lot of that book comes just from, yeah, eavesdropping at desi parties.
Absorbing everything.
I was. thought, what a great way to get material for my books for from now on forever. But that did not happen because as soon as Arranged Marriage, my first book of stories, got published, the next time I walked into a Desi party, everyone was like, "We're not going to talk. She's here. She's taking notes." So I had to
That's
calm down.
so.
Yes.
In fact, there's a comment from Lakshmi Raman, who's one of our members, that it sounds like Priya's experience of going abroad. When you were talking about, not having the internet and all that. So yes, that is true. So I want to come
Yes,
to a
of course,
question.
Priya is way before. Her experience would have been much harder because at that time, even to get a letter from India, especially because this was during the war, it was very difficult. It would have been much harder for her because there were pretty much no Indian women in her whole city, in her whole university. And I hope I've been able to bring that out. That whole sense of, yes, excitement, but also a deep longing for home at the same time.
Absolutely. So there is a question that I've been meaning to ask you, which is, if you could have a conversation with any of your characters, who would that be and what would you ask them?
I think I would like to talk to Draupadi most and to say, hey, did I get your character right? Did I manage to, especially the parts where it's about your emotions and thoughts, and I would be especially interested in her relationship with Krishna because he is her best friend and her guide, and how did that feel? And that for me was one of my favorite parts of the book, so I would ask her.
Okay, okay, that's good to know. So, not many, or maybe, okay, maybe many of you know, the people who are here today, that Chitra started out as a poet. So, how much of poetry do you go back to? Because you had arranged marriage after that, and it kind of, your identity is as a author of fiction, and of course now non-fiction with The Last Queen and Uncommon Love. But do you still go back to poetry?
I do go back to poetry to mostly to read it just because I love reading poetry. I think I have incorporated everything I learned as a poet into my fiction writing because images are very important for me. Images and colors and the sound of words, those are all very important to me as they were in writing poetry. So, that's my hope that I have been able to create an appropriately poetic style as needed when people say things or when I'm describing things. And poetry is very image based. So I think my prose writing is also very image based.
Absolutely. Could you quickly tell us, how did arranged marriage come about? Because you were writing poetry, you had a published book. So how did
Yes,
arranged marriage
I
come
had
about?
two published books, in fact, three by the time I wrote Arranged Marriage. But in the last book published, that I had published, poetry, Leaving Yuba City, I found that I was writing groups of poems. For example, Leaving Yuba City, the title refers to one of the poems in a group called the Yuba City Poems. And Yuba City was one of the first places that um, Indian immigrants, mostly Punjabi immigrants, settled in. They had come as railroad workers and they went on to live there and become farmers and are now a very successful and interesting community. So I had in five poems traced that journey up to current times. So I recognized that I was becoming very interested in character, in story, and in different voices. So I knew it was time for me to try a different genre where I could really focus on story, character, and voice, and the movement of plot. I think that's so it was kind of a natural movement into the short stories of Arranged Marriage. I wasn't yet ready for one large story, like in Mistress of Spices, which would become my first novel. So the short story was a very good segue point for me.
Okay, thank you for that, Chitra. Before I move on to questions, we have quite a few questions, observations, and I would love to read them out. But before I move on, what I want to know from you is how do you want your work to be viewed by future South Asian writers?
I have no I have no thoughts about that. I have presented the books. I hope people will read them. I hope people will connect to them. I hope they will find something of value. But really, that is not in my hands. That's really in the reader's hands. So I trust the readers. I trust time. I hope some of my stories will still be relevant after some years or decades. But that's really all. I think when I send the book into the world, my job is done. The rest is, I really trust and depend on all of you, people like you, readers, to tell other readers about these books if you like them and to maybe, write about them. Nowadays, there's so many wonderful venues on the internet where one can write one's comments about books or present one's comments about books. So really, I think my job was just to write. The rest of it is belongs to the reader.
True that. But who are your favorite authors? Who do you love to read and you've like been reading for a long time?
Well, one of them, very traditional and maybe to be expected, is Tagore. I grew up reading Tagore's stories and went back to reading them again and teach some of them. I teach, for instance, his book, The Home and the World, quite regularly at the University of Houston, where I'm teaching writers in the creative writing program. So Tagore has always been one of my go-to. Just he is so good at portraying, first of all, his time, and secondly, women characters for a man of his period to be so sensitive about what was going on in the lives of women and how many ways in which they were really stymied by social constrictions, even when they were very talented. Um, he really brings that out. He's got so many interesting worlds that he writes about, historical as well as contemporary of his time. So he is a really go-to writer. After I came to the US, I became very interested in women's voices, especially women's voices from many different cultures, because that was very similar to my project. So people like Maxine Hong Kingston, Amy Tan, Gloria Naylor, writing out of the African American experience, Toni Morrison, um, sometimes very different voices like Margaret Atwood, who is a Canadian writer, but many of her books have had huge impacts on me, especially The Handmaid's Tale. So, yeah, I became very interested in multiple women's voices, and now, of course, I read more contemporary Indian writers as well and Indian American writers. Amitabh Ghosh is always a big favorite, especially when I was writing my historical novels. I would go back and look at how he was doing things in his historical novels.
Okay, that's great to know. I will, come to some of the. Of course, we have lots of questions, but we'll come to, many of them are here as well. So Geeta has asked, Shobha's question we have already asked you. Geeta has asked, she said, I really love your style of writing. In the Palace of Illusions, you have clearly brought out the secret love that Draupadi had for Karna. During your research, did you discover this or was it your own take on the dimension?
So there's an a Bengali Mahabharat by Kashiram Das in which this is mentioned. Now, both uh, Draupadi and Karna, they are people with high moral standards. So, other than feeling something in their heart, there was nothing else that they would do because they had their duties, they had their roles, they had their values. But it's certainly mentioned as something, and it begins as in Palace of Illusions, and that part is in other Mahabharats also, that when Draupadi is getting ready for her marriage, for her Swayamvar, where she's going to pick a husband, news comes to her that the Pandavas, all five of them, have died in a fire. If you remember, that was a plot by Duryodhan, but they did not die. They escaped through the tunnel, but nobody knows this. So when Draupadi is thinking of who then is worthy of me in this audience, she says, "Who is the greatest warrior of this time?" And people say to her, "Well, Karna is since anyway, Karna was a great warrior, probably better than at least four of the other Pandavas. But now with Arjun out of the picture, he's certainly the best one." So in her mind, she has already set that Karna is the right one for me. And then other things will happen. But right from that moment, and Karna also, who has come to the Swayamvar wanting to marry Draupadi, there's something from his side as well. Now, there's an interesting novel by Pratibha Ray, which is many years before my time, where it's called Yagna Seni. And in that, she goes much more into, she picks up things from Tagore's poetry, and she goes much more into this aspect of the relationship. So once I read about that early part where he comes to the Swayamvar, but because of reasons she cannot accept him, then I started thinking about, well, what would have been their way of thinking about each
Thank you, Chitra. That was a question in many of our minds. So there is a question from Aruna Peri. When the story is flowing through you, do you write it down or orally record it and transcribe it later?
other. I write everything down. I'm a very writing oriented person. I have to see it on either on the screen or on paper. So I also have a lot of notebooks in which I will take notes about characters. And, I'll just, yeah, once I get an idea for the novel, I'll start putting an outline also on paper. So yeah, that's still how I think. I have to have all my notes by the side. I compose on the computer, but all my notes are handwritten on the side.
So Uma has mentioned that she loved Palace of Illusions, and there's a question connected to it that isn't it being made into a movie, and how do you feel about that?
Yes, it has been optioned for a movie. I hope, my hope is I love movies myself, so my hope is that it will be made into a good movie with sensitivity about her, Draupadi's character, particularly. It's a long process because I think, they do want to do a good job with it. So I, I'm, I have not been given any dates, but I'm just as eager as anyone to see what happens. And again, I really, really hope that they will preserve the nuances of the characters.
Yes, we hope so too, because many of us love that book. We'll be sending you, there are many comments on, I don't know if you can read them now, or we'll be sending them to you later on, people's thoughts and observations. If we have time, I'll read them out later. Let me go to the questions first. So Aarti has asked, how do you come up with the multiple layers in all the characters? Even though the stories may be different, there is an element of relatability. There is something about your work that gets a reader hooked onto your writing. So, what goes on in your mind while you develop these characters? In fact, she's mentioned what particularly amazed me was how you developed one amazing thing about people trapped in a building due to an earthquake, which is actually very different from your other books. So she's
It
asked,
is
how
very
do
different.
you...
Yeah, because it's people of all backgrounds, right? I wanted to
Yes.
write a book where people have come to the Indian consulate because they all want to come to India. They've come for their visas. They all want to come to India, but they're coming for different reasons and they're from different backgrounds. There's, white people, there's black people, there's a Chinese American woman who actually grew up in Kolkata, where there's a large Chinese contingent. And, many people, there are Hindus, there are Muslims, there are Christians, there's African Americans. And I wanted to give a kind of overview of many different cultures people coming from different cultures, but with one purpose. They all want to come to India for some important reason of their own. So yeah, it took a long time. It took a long time. It takes a long time to write for me to write characters. Especially, I mean, when I start writing a book, I'm in that world all the time. I kind of go through my life like a zombie, and my family is like, oh, she's in her book world. So yeah, that's, little by little, I make notes, I think, I try out dialogue, I try to get the character's voice. That's very important for me. So I wanted to point to another book of mine, which may be of interest, which is Before We Visit the Goddess, which is a book about women of three generations, a grandmother, her daughter, and her daughter. So the grandmother lives in India all her life, but she's in connection with her daughter. Her daughter immigrates to the US, and then her daughter grows up, is born in the US, and is always going to live in the US. And how does she still connect? What is her connection, especially with her grandmother? And so it's a family saga of three generations, which I hope you will take a look at, because it also looks at another phenomenon that is important in our society today, which is that the children grow abroad and the parents are left in India. And how does that work? What are the complications of that?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chitra. I'll come to the next question, which is something we also had, an uncommon love, which is also a departure from your previous writing. Uh, which is so this is from Ramesh. He's asked an uncommon love, which is about the early life of Sudha and Narayan Murthy, is was wonderful and goes into a lot of details about their early struggles. How much time did you have to spend with them to get so much information? Because they seem to have really opened up to you.
Yes, I feel very blessed that they did open up to me. This was an important story, I felt, which is why I took on the project. It's different from everything else I've written because it's nonfiction. It came about because the publisher approached me and said that we think this would be very important. It is at once, um, in their story would be insightful for many people in different areas, certainly people who are struggling to start their own company or follow a dream, but also just as a template for married couples who both have, strong desires for their own careers. How do you make it work? What about when you have family? Anyway, all of those were interesting to me, and the Murthis had said no to a lot of people, but when my this publisher suggested my name, they said yes, they would be willing. So we did a lot of the work ahead of time over Zoom. I interviewed them over Zoom. And I recorded everything. I also interviewed them uh, via emails where I would write questions and they would send me back answers. And Mr. Murthy was particularly, he's so meticulous and he had kept notes of everything. So he would be able to send me like large chunks of answers, which then I could incorporate. But apart from information, I really wanted to get uh, the feeling of their relationship, their early romance and all of that. The difficulties of starting a, a business when you don't have any money, and then the children come along, how are you going to balance? So, all of that is in the book. I actually then, the final stage, not the final stage, the second to final stage was my husband and I went to Bangalore and we spent quite a lot of time with them and intense. Like from morning, we would I would be at their house, talking and taking notes and recording, and then we'd have lunch together. Then we'd rest. We'd go back to the hotel and rest, and then another session in the evening. So it was pretty intense, but they were so, they were very open. They were very honest. They talked about, if you read that book, not only their success moments, but also their failure moments, the moments when they felt really low, the moments when they had to struggle, when they had to come together as a couple, and when they fought about things, when they had disagreements. So that was a very different kind of book for me to write. But I'm very happy I did it. I think it's a worthwhile story. So if you haven't picked it up, I hope all of you will.
Yes, would surely love to. I personally haven't read it yet. Was there something that surprised you when you were into, in something that came out in that interaction that completely took you by surprise about them?
Yes, lots of things, especially about Mr. Murthy, because everyone has, including me, has this picture of him as being very serious and stern and, very dedicated to his values and morals, which all of which he is. But he told me some very funny stories from his childhood. For instance, he used to be a terror in the classroom when he was little. He would sit in the back bench and be chatting with his friends while the teacher is talking. You wouldn't expect that, right? And so he grew up also in small towns, so the teacher would actually come to the back of the room, grab him by his ear, and pull him to the front and make him sit in the first bench. And then when the teacher turned around to write on the board, he would run back to the back benches. So, stories like that. I thought that was quite charming, and their early days, their romances and all of that. And I thought a very funny part of the book is Sudha's dad did not like Mr. Murthy. He did not think that, he was a man. What is all this starting a business idea of, just get a job, get a proper salary. And so he didn't agree for a while for Sudha to marry him. And Sudha and her mom, they had to work on her dad to get permission to get married. And all of that, thinking back in retrospect is pretty funny, right? Because Sudha's dad is saying, this young man, he's a good for nothing. Why do you want to marry him? You will have to support the family all your life.
Yes, absolutely. That certainly, yes, looking back, it is funny one. Thank you for sharing that with us. There are two more questions that I'll quickly go to. We know we have you till 9:45, and we are sure you have to, start your day. So, Sutapa has asked, in Independence, you have used songs and verses at critical times during the storytelling, and it adds layers to the narrative. So, is there any particular reason behind that?
Yeah, partly it is historical, right? During the freedom struggle, songs were so important because that is how people came together. They would march, they would be singing these songs. A number of songs were banned. For example, Vande Mataram was a banned song. If you sung it, you would be beaten up and thrown in jail. And in spite of that, people would be marching, singing that song. So it just was so moving to me when I found out these things. And I had, in Bengal grown up with a lot of these songs. Tagore wrote some very important freedom songs. In fact, as you know, the national anthem of India was from one of his poems set to music, and then Amar Shonar Bangla, which is the national anthem of Bangladesh, is also from Tagore. So, and not only Tagore, but another important poet slash songwriter of that time, Nazrul Islam, was writing these very patriotic songs and poems. And I wanted to bring that into the book because I wanted to give people kind of an auditory experience of how it has been. And if you have the book, you will see that there's a QR code, right in the beginning. Um,
Yes.
I hope I can find it, but you probably see it.
Yes, there are.
Anyway,
There is a QR code. Yes.
yes, there's a QR code. Here it is. There's a QR code, right? And if you just click on that QR code, it'll take you to all of the songs. And um, HarperCollins was very nice. They said, well, there are many of versions of these songs, but which are your favorite versions? So I picked all my favorite versions, which I felt were most authentic. And they're all there for you for your listening pleasure. So I hope you will mention this to other friends as well, because maybe not everybody noticed the QR code.
That's a QR code was a great idea. So, quickly moving on to the other question, which is from Jayashree. How much do you get emotionally involved with the characters you write about?
I get very emotionally involved. So I'm kind of living there. stories, their I don't know, their achievements, but also especially their pain, their fear, all of that. So a lot of times when I was writing Independence, I was in tears as I was writing portions where all of the people, but especially the three sisters, are going through really difficult, frightening moments, moments of danger, moments of loneliness. So, yeah, I feel all of that. And sometimes when I'm doing research, I get very moved, and I have to be. I mean, I don't try to stop myself because if the book is to have an emotional impact on the reader, I feel the book has to first have an emotional impact on me. So yeah, I'm very emotionally involved with characters and events and hopefully happy moments as well. But it's the painful moments that are more intense.
Absolutely.
When I was looking at photographs of partition and even photographs of uh, after Direct Action Day, the big riot that took place in Kolkata, it was just so heartbreaking to see, all the people that were killed, all the buildings that were burned. It was just very hard to see.
Absolutely. And probably that emotional involvement is what makes your characters so memorable for so many of us. A very quick question. Is there a character that has remained with you, which you may have written after many years? Maybe not at that time. Maybe you would have worked on something else. Has that happened ever with any character?
I think that is what happened with Sita, because right after I wrote Palace of Illusions, I said, well, now I want to write Forest of Enchantments. But I just wasn't mentally ready because the Ramayana is such an important story. Sita is such an icon in our culture that I think I had to mature before I could really understand and appreciate the kind of courage that Sita has, which is a much quieter and more mature kind of courage than Draupadi. Draupadi just, when she doesn't like something, she just goes at it and, expresses her opinion. And Sita's is much more subtle, where she works her way around things, but is always strong and never compromises. So I had to really grow as a person to be able to write her character.
Absolutely. There's a question that we had in our list, which we'll quickly ask you, which is, have you ever been apprehensive about writing anything?
Yes, all the time. I was apprehensive when I wrote Palace of Illusions. I was much more apprehensive when I wrote Forest of Enchantments because, um, the the cultural feel of India had changed by then, and there was a real sense that only one story is correct and not the others. There's one viewpoint that should be adhered to, and it was never the women's viewpoint, okay? So that was already, I felt, um, somewhat difficult, dangerous enterprise when I'm writing the story of independence, um, especially with Muslim characters and the Hindu Muslim marriage that's at the center of the book. I was worried. I was worried about a lot of things, but ultimately, you write the best book you can, you write it honestly, you focus on facts. I'm not making things up. All these things were happening at that time. And you hope for the best. You hope for intelligent readers who understand that the book is written with as much honesty as possible. And it is written to bring out those times as realistically as I can manage. There's no other agenda than creating a good book with strong characters, uh, honestly and accurately portraying the times in which the book is based.
Thank you, Chitra. That's bravely and perfectly said. So thank you
Well,
so
send
much.
some good energies, send me some good energies
Oh,
because
yes.
it
Absolutely.
is,
And we hope we'll see a book from you soon. In fact, one of the things that, yes, someone has just said, yes, Aruna has said, nice to see you again, Chitra. Hope you come to Bangalore soon with your next book. The Bangalore Lit Fest
thank
is,
you,
yes,
thank
going to
you.
be starting
Right
soon.
now, I'm just writing. I'm kind of in the beginning of a book. So until that is finished and published, no more travel for me. I like to stay close to home when I'm writing. And, because, yeah, I just try to keep my life simple when I write so that I have most time and energy for writing. So I write and I teach, and other than 4 books, I I try not to travel too much. Once in a while for family things, but not otherwise.
That's a lot of work, writing and teaching. So we really hope
But
we'll
I
have
do
a good.
love, I love both of them. And the teaching really helps my writing because it keeps me thinking about things and keeps me in touch with new books and so forth.
Yes, that's very interesting. In fact, one of the, if you could tell where you are joining from today, and where we know that we have heard about your teaching, but if you could tell us exactly what do you teach and where do you teach from?
Yes, I live in Houston. I teach at the University of Houston in the creative writing program. It's a world-renowned program. We get writers from all over the world. In fact, right now I have a few Indian writers from India who have come all the way to study with me. And I love teaching. It really, yeah, it's very fulfilling that whatever little I know and I've learned to be able to pass it on to young writers and to help them in creating their stories. I find that very satisfying. So that's what I do. I teach half the year, and the other half of the year is for my writing exclusively, although I do continue working with, if I am the advisor for a dissertation student or a thesis student, I'll continue working with them.
Thank you
So
so
that's what
much.
I do.
Thank you. Thank you for being so open with us and answering everything and having a wonderful interaction. So thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. And thank you everyone. We hope you
Thank
enjoyed
you.
this
Really
interaction with
enjoyed.
us today.
Yes, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. I hope that all of you will become ambassadors for my books and tell all your friends about them because, word of mouth is the best way to spread the knowledge of books that have been loved. So, and
Yes.
thank you very much for inviting me today.
Thank you. Thank
Enjoyed
you.
all the questions.
Thank you so much. That's a great honor to hear that. Thank you.
Take care.